Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mailbox for the 21st of September 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, as mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is Borderlands 2. You will have my full opinion on it after I've had a chance to play more of it. What I will say to start with is the first 2 hours are bloody slow. The claptrap is incredibly irritating, and for the most part it seems to be more of the same. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. I'll let you know once I've played a good deal more of it as to what my opinion of it actually is. The first email comes in here from Jonathan that says, in your Fall of Cybertron WTF is, you mentioned the idea that the game is, in your opinion, the Arkham City/Arkham Asylum sort of hallmark for Transformers games. Not quote for quote, I try to paraphrase. My question is this: has Arkham franchise actually become sort of a benchmark for all licensed games? The games are very good, but is it fair on developers that gaming sites will always try to compare their games to the idea of, is it the Arkham Asylum of X series? Well, yeah, of course it's fair. You kidding me? Oh no, people are being held to account and have to make good licensed games. Truly, this is the end of civilization. Now, the problem for the most part is that licensed games suck. And that's a real problem, because it exploits the people that love those franchises by selling them crappy merchandise. And when you play a licensed game these days, you have a certain expectation that it's probably going to suck. Why do you have that? Well, because past history. There's so many bad licensed games that it's safer to assume a game's going to be bad than it's going to be good, because most of the time you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Arkham Asylum was not the first good licensed game, not by any stretch of the imagination. There are plenty others. There's a lot of good Star Wars titles, for instance, but it is one of very few magnificent licensed games, and a lot of the other magnificent licensed games are now consigned to gaming history because they are quite old. Star Wars has plenty of magnificent games. X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter would be a good example. Rogue Squadron would be a good example. Knights of the Old Republic would be a good example. Those are magnificent games. They're not merely good. Star Trek has a few magnificent games. The Final Unity would be a good example. Starfleet Command 2 would be another example. Bridge Commander would perhaps be the third. These games are of extremely high quality, but if you look through the other licenses, can you honestly tell me that they contain magnificent games? There aren't really all that many that focus entirely on the core franchise. There's a few mix-ups here and there, and Marvel vs. Capcom is a good example, but at the end of the day, all that does is it takes the characters and puts them into a fighting game. It's really much more difficult to actually create a game that is heavily steeped in the franchise and takes from all elements of the franchise to actually build a franchise-specific world. Marvel vs. Capcom really does not do that. Arkham Asylum, on the other hand, absolutely does. I think the hallmark of a truly great licensed game is when the license assists in conveying an exceptional gaming experience. It does not become the sole focus of the gaming experience. It doesn't become a crutch or an excuse. The litmus test is this: if you took the license away from game X, would it still be a good game? If the answer is yes, then it is a good game. But you also have to bear in mind, does it get better as a result of the license? If the answer for that is no, then you've got to wonder, well, why the hell is it licensed to begin with? The license should elevate the game. It shouldn't be a crutch for it, nor should it be absolutely irrelevant. It should elevate it, it should make it better. That's what Arkham Asylum does. It takes locations and characters from the Batman franchise, and it creates an exceptionally good action-adventure surrounding it. You could take Batman the Joker and everything out of the game, replace them with generic characters, and it would still be a good game, because it has very solid mechanics, it's very graphically impressive, it has a wide variety of environments, and it has a really great combat system. It also happens to reward exploration. Arkham City kind of does the same thing. It improves on the combat system, puts a lot more variety in there. Some would argue that it's not quite as structured, so they don't like it quite as much, but it's still a really good game. I don't think it's remotely unfair to hold other developers to that standard. I think if you've got a big license, that is the way that you should actually treat it. You should treat it with the utmost respect, and you should allow it to elevate your title to the next level. Until we see that happening more regularly, then this is going to continue. Unfortunately, it's not commonplace to find a game of the quality of Arkham Asylum, much less a licensed title as good as Arkham Asylum. And until it does become commonplace, these comparisons will continue. And quite frankly, it's a really good benchmark for that kind of thing. If you're going to have a big budget licensed title, yes, it should be as good as Arkham Asylum. And honestly, when companies are being paid to make licensed products and have a lot of budget behind them, then I really don't have a lot of sympathy when it turns out to suck. Quite frankly, neither should you, because these games are created to exploit people like you that like the licenses. Why would you support that? Why would you even give an inch to that kind of business strategy? I hate it. I despise it, and as a consumer, so should you. This one comes in from Ape of Fortune that says, as a fairly new player of MMORPGs, I was surprised when my friend, a heavy MMO player, told me that he's not enjoying Guild Wars 2. When I asked him about it, he stated that although he thought the game was good, it felt as if he'd done it all before, and thus did not find the game as engaging as I did. This got me thinking about whether or not it's possible to not only become bored with the game, but with the entire genre it's associated with. As you are someone with extensive knowledge and first-hand experience with MMOs and gaming in general, do you think it's possible to get genre boredom, or is it mainly a problem with the MMO genre itself? As a final thought, have you ever become bored of an entire genre personally, and if so, what helped revamp the genre for you, if anything? I don't think I've ever become bored of an entire genre. I've dipped in and out of interest levels with it, and that's mostly due to the way that it's been designed. I used to play a lot of FPS, and then I didn't play as many of them for a while, and that was mostly because there just weren't any FPS that really grabbed me all that much. And then I played a lot more multiplayer FPS, and I kind of got back into it, and now I play both single and multiplayer first-person shooters. There are other genres that just didn't end up catering to me in one way or the other, one being the brawler genre. The problem with that was there weren't all that many of them. We haven't had all that many beat-em-ups, and there's a small revival going on now thanks to Steam, Xbox Live Arcade, and PSN, but it's still not where I want it to be. There is, of course, the RPG genre that I very much like, but I don't have the time to play anymore, so the amount of RPGs that I get involved in has now drastically decreased. But it's not due to a lack of interest. I very much want to play The Witcher 2. I don't have the time. I very much want to play a rather large number of other RPGs that I simply do not have the time to deal with. But MMOs is a special case, I think. And the reason it's a special case is, I would imagine, because the genre itself is actually really terrible. Now, bear with me on this for a second. The problem with MMORPGs, and I say RPGs specifically because MMO is not a genre. MMO is a prefix that can be added to a number of different genres. So what about MMORPGs? Well, they're just not very good for the most part. And even WoW isn't very good. Guild Wars 2 isn't actually all that good either. Why? Because in terms of game mechanics, they have to sacrifice so much in order to make sure that the MMO prefix actually sticks. And when it comes down to MMOs, storytelling is a very, very weak point. Why? Because you've got to tell the same story to everyone, and it's a complete immersion shatterer. You can't permanently change anything. You can phase, and that will sometimes change a few things, minor details, but you can't wipe out an entire town or anything like that. It becomes ridiculous, and the amount of contrivance that has to happen and the amount of trickery that has to be put into the game in order to make out like you are a hero going on this quest or whatever, and it's not simply a shopping list that everyone is doing. It just gets to the point of being ridiculous, and honestly, Guild Wars 2 still suffers from this. I just think that MMORPGs are very weak video games. They rely very much on the fact that there are a lot of people in it, and it's not a case of having a lot of people enhance the genre, it's having a lot of people replace the good parts of the genre. You are replacing great storytelling, you are replacing complex combat and in-depth, well-developed characters with a lot of other people. It's quantity over quality. And that is going to be a very difficult problem to solve. I think, honestly, it is most likely something that can never be solved within the current framework of MMORPGs. I think that MMO is going to go in the direction of different genres where it actually works properly. You can make a fully functional multiplayer shooter that is an MMO and does not sacrifice what makes a multiplayer shooter great. PlanetSide 2 is an example of this, and no doubt there will be many more. You can make a really large MMO RTS. That can be done. You can also do it with sports games, and to some degree with action-adventures, but with RPGs, I feel that the experience is a very personal one, and RPGs very much rely on the ability to play a role, and the limitations of MMOs prevent that from happening. You need these really well-developed storylines and characters, and you don't get them. You need these truly shocking events and big twists and turns, and you don't get those either. You need a complex, in-depth, and satisfying combat system, and you don't get that either. None of these things can actually occur, at least at the moment, within MMORPGs, and I feel that some of these problems could never be solved. I am finding myself currently experiencing genre boredom with MMORPGs. I actually have no enthusiasm to play Guild Wars 2, even though I enjoyed it very much in the beta. I can't be bothered with sinking so much time into yet another game like that. I just don't want to. At this point, I feel like I would rather play a lengthy single-player RPG, even though I don't have the time to do that either, than invest time in an MMORPG that I quite frankly do not enjoy 100% of the time, because the combat system is just so simplistic and the quests are just so repetitive. Even within Guild Wars 2 that happens, although to a lesser extent. If I want to do boring quests, I can do them in Skyrim, and then I'll have a more interesting environment to explore. I don't think that MMORPGs are really for me anymore. I fail to find the kind of enjoyment in them that I used to, but even back when I first started playing WoW in 2004, I hated questing in that game. And I guess until MMORPGs are able to completely abandon that concept, then I will probably still remain sick of them. So there you go. I guess MMORPGs are the one genre that it's very possible to get genre boredom from. This one comes in from Gary128 that says, I was talking with a friend of mine the other day about Diablo 3. He felt that the game had been polished too much, that everything was doled out in just the right amount at just the right time, that it became sterile and boring. While I enjoyed the game, I certainly see his point. A game being polished is usually considered a good thing, but when we look at games like Minecraft, the bugs and quirks are not only things that people learn to put up with, but often become elements people enjoy about the game. Is it possible for a game to be too polished? What do you think differentiates bugs and quirks that people despise versus the ones they come to love, like strafe jumping in Quake? Well, I think the answer's fairly simple, really. A bug or a quirk that gets in the way of your enjoyment of the game is one that you don't like. One that actually becomes enjoyable in and of itself is something that you do like. Strafe jumping never made the game worse. It never got in the way of you enjoying it. In fact, it actually added a new way to enjoy the game and to experience it, and it even resulted in speedrunning. I mean, this is how speedrunning in Quake actually happened. You couldn't do it without strafe jumping. There are other games where this is evident. There are arguments that the way that carriers worked in the original StarCraft Brood War was not intentional. It was actually a quirk, and yet it enabled some very skillful micro, and it actually allowed the game to be more competitive and that unit to be used in a much more effective way. Now, an example of the opposite occurring was in Half-Life Black Mesa. They decided to take strafe jumping out of the game, and just before you ask what strafe jumping is, it's essentially the idea that in certain games, usually FPS, you are able to increase speed to far beyond what you can usually get by running, by jumping and strafing at the same time, and then doing a turn in the air, and then immediately jumping again upon landing. And that allows you to increase your speed, and the technique can be used in Half-Life 2, in the original Half-Life, Quake 3 Arena, for instance, Soldier of Fortune 2, Doom 3, and in fact it came from the original Quake engine. The bug was discovered a very long time ago. It's not like the programmers didn't know about it. They knew about it and they kept it in because they felt that it actually added an additional element to the game, and indeed, it became a staple of those kind of FPSs. Now, Half-Life Black Mesa took it out completely. In fact, they nerfed jumping so much that it is almost entirely useless, and it is very, very annoying indeed. They stated that they did not want it in their version of the game, so they took it out, and I feel that the game actually does suffer just a little bit as a result. Not a huge amount, but a little. Is there such a thing as a game being too polished? Yes, there is. Some of the most fun in video games comes from the feeling that you are overpowered, and more often than not, that is derived from either quirks within the system, perhaps minor bugs or imbalances, which later, in the grand scheme of things, actually do become balanced. I think a lot of people don't seem to realize, like, for instance, with StarCraft Brood War, that taken on its own, there are many elements of that game that can be considered overpowered, units that can be considered overpowered, and yet within the overall competitive ecosystem of the game, it is considered balanced. When you have an overly polished game, you can never have that sense of balance that comes from things being on their own overpowered, and yet when everything is taken into consideration, there is balance, and there is a reason why that game has such a high skill ceiling. If you were to take strafe jumping out of a competitive shooter like Quake 3, then Quake 3 would be a significantly weaker game. There are even elements of games that are not bugs, they were deliberate design choices, but feel a bit quirky, that if taken away from the game would also weaken it. Taking the idea that you can run faster with a knife out of Counter-Strike, for instance, would actually screw the game up. It is balanced around the idea that you can run faster with a knife, and there are tactical reasons for doing so. An overly polished game might consider that to be silly, because you're still carrying the same amount of equipment. You shouldn't be able to run faster with just a knife out, that's ridiculous. And as a result, you may not have that element in the game, and that would detract from the overall experience. I think a lot of it comes down to fear. The developers want a lot of control, and they're afraid of what their players might do to the game if given too much control. I think there's a fundamental difference there between, say, Diablo 3 and Torchlight 2, in that the developers of Torchlight 2 are not afraid of what gamers could do to their own characters, or could actually do to the game of Torchlight 2. Whereas with Blizzard and Diablo 3, it's exactly the opposite. They hold a very tight grip on what is done with that game. They are consistently balancing it and changing it so that things the players are doing are no longer effective if Blizzard doesn't like them doing it. There is no modding, there is, of course, no offline character system of any description. It is this attitude, I feel, that leads to the so-called over-polish, and it actually has a lot more negative effects, and it's perhaps a far wider-ranging idea than simply wanting to polish your game up to a mirror shine. If you were to look at the very simple idea of polishing a game, then you should view that as a good thing. It's good that Blizzard games don't have that many bugs, and I say that many because recently, yes, they do, but less than other titles. It's good that polish is applied. But I fear that overly polishing a title can be a symptom of a much deeper design problem, and as a result, some overly polished games like Diablo 3 simply do not satisfy in the same way as more rough and tumble titles. Alright folks, that's me done for the day and done for the week. Thank you very much for watching the mailbox. I must apologise for there not being a mailbox yesterday. That was due to the fact that I just come back from my physical and I had a bunch of needles stuck in me and it made me just a little bit ill, so I wasn't feeling too good. Feeling good now, however, so all is fine, and I shall resume the mailbox as expected on Monday. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you next time.